Good evening and thanks for turning out this evening. I appreciate it. First off, let me assure you that I'm not a Navy recruiter, although I once was. Also, let me assure you that I'm not a commissioned officer in the Navy, although I once was. I'm just an old guy in his 50-year-old uniform who has a passion for the Navy, and I'm wearing the uniform just to put a patina of authenticity on my remarks. I also have a passion for reading good books, and I'll be trying to sell you this evening on reading some of these books. After all, it is a library. I'm not a salesman, but I was once. I'd like to start with a little simple geography. A lot of us, if you even studied geography in school, looked at a lot of flat maps and atlases and stuff. I want to give you a view of the way things really look. As I face you directly, see how much land you don't see. As I face you directly, this is the size of the Pacific Ocean. Actually, our planet is over 70% water and less than 30% land. The Pacific Ocean is so big that if the other planets were rubber and you could move them around, you could fit every continent in the Pacific Ocean and have room for one extra Africa and one extra North America. Remember the size of this thing when we're talking about the pivot to the Pacific in terms of the mission of the Navy when I talk about World War II. It's a big place. This is a flat map just to talk a little bit about sea power. Sea power is a combination of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines. The United States didn't invent Marines. They have existed since the beginning of time. The word Marine means fighters from the sea. And back centuries ago, any ship that went out usually carried fighters aboard to either go to another ship and capture it or to do something on land to take land away from an enemy. So Marines are not new to the United States. So sea power is a combination of the two. Currently, and it has been all along, our Commander-in-Chief, the President, determines what the mission of the Navy is along with his foreign policy. Then Congress monitors that and doles out the money. So the Navy's in a position of bickering with Congress all the time to get money to do stuff. Currently, with the mission that's been described for the Navy, they've asked for a fleet of 313 ships. We have 285. And in the bickering with Congress, Congress is reluctantly focused on 306 as a compromise, but to get there will take some years of shipbuilding. It's possible that we'll dip as low as 270 before we get back to where we were at 285. Now these numbers vary from year to year, and I'm giving you kind of ballpark figures because we are decommissioning ships and commissioning ships at odd times. Now, our ships are spread out over fleets. And I want you to concentrate on just a few numbers up here. The Fifth Fleet is in the Indian Ocean, close to the hot spots around Iran. The Seventh Fleet is home ported out of Japan and is there primarily because the Chinese emerging threat. And you've probably heard the President say in a recent speech that we're pivoting to the Pacific. That's because of the China threat. All along this coast we have allies who are shaking in their boots because China is building up its Navy at a rapid rate. We have Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia. All of these nations are building up their navies in anticipation of some problems. The Sixth Fleet is in the Mediterranean. And what we have with the shortage of ships is a problem in that ships can't always be where they need to be for a hotspot. You may remember the second presidential debate between Romney and Obama. Romney commented that our Navy is the size it was in 1915. From a debate point of view, that left him wide open to Obama's remarks about we also have a lot less bayonets and horses, which helped him win in debate points. But the reality is the number of ships do count. What Obama said was that we're not counting ships, we're interested in capability. The truth is that any ship in the Navy has much more capability than it had in World War I, and even much more capability than it had in World War II. But it can't be in two places at the same time, and that's the problem. So as we get hotspot after hotspot, we're forced to play a giant game of whack-a-mole. I don't know how much time you spend in arcades, but there's a game with a bunch of holes and a hammer with a cord on it, and a mole pops out of the hole and the kid whacks it, and then it's a test of how fast he can jump back and forth. It's called whack-a-mole. This is a giant game of whack-a-mole. I'll give you some examples of that in a few minutes. I hit the button and it worked. If you've been watching the news lately, you know that the mission is defined by elected civilians, not by the Navy itself. And I hope from the discussions this evening that you might be a little bit more informed about some of the issues about sea power and the size of the Navy. We've enjoyed control of the oceans since World War II. And I thought I'd run through a list of why we want to control the oceans, which we've done ever since then. We built up a massive Navy for World War II. And there's benefits in sea power. Those benefits have been known for centuries. Even when ships were in just regions or like the Mediterranean Sea, there are tremendous benefits to sea power. There's a historical evidence that sea power begets commerce, commerce begets sea power. It's a spiral that can go up, it's a spiral that can go down. If you're spiraling up with increased commerce, there's an increased tax base and there's more money to build ships. The spiral can be broken when your economy heads south or when you lose a war. And there'll be some examples of that as we go on. Ruling the oceans, this is just a list I put together, and it's not official government doctrine necessarily, but one of the reasons you want to control the oceans is to support safe world trade for all. Over 95% of all world trade takes place with ships on the ocean, and it's to our advantage to make sure that any country can ensure themselves safe passage throughout the ocean, which is just full of choke points that can be sealed off by somebody that wants to do that, either to their advantage or to someone's disadvantage. We want to keep the sea lanes open and world trade be something anybody can do. We want to have influence and intimidation on the world stage. It's very important that when necessary, we want to be regarded as the biggest dog on the block. And when we say something, it carries a lot of weight. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of some other nation. We want to be able to resolve conflicts to our advantage. There are three ways to handle a conflict that comes up. The first is intervention. Intervention ultimately could lead to what they call boots on the ground these days. If you're in a climate that the United States is in today, you don't want to intervene unless you're in your second term. There is a real isolationist mood sweeping the country based on current polls. The second thing you can do in a conflict is show overpowering strength and threaten force with meaning, and then try to work it out diplomatically. And I'll give examples of all of these in just a minute. The third thing you can do with a conflict is ignore it. We do that a lot with a lot of genocides going on in Africa, and there's a lot of other things that we kind of let go by and don't get involved. I read somewhere that if the Middle East had a monopoly on oranges instead of oil, we wouldn't be so interested in the Middle East. But we take conflicts seriously where our interests are really at stake, and we tend to brush aside those cases where it isn't. Just a couple of quick examples. The Cuban Missile Blockade, October 1962, Khrushchev and Castro cooked up a scheme to put Soviet Union missiles, ICBMs with nuclear warheads, in Cuba. Sea power was important to President Kennedy because he got 60 ships to circle Cuba. This is not whack-a-mole. This is back when we had a bigger Navy. 60 ships encircled Cuba. That was very important to his second alternative of showing great strength, threatening with meaning, and having visibly something to back it up. And if you think about today, the reason Khrushchev and Castro hatched this plot was they saw weakness in Kennedy. This comes from the Bay of Pigs and some other arrangements where they heard Kennedy speak. So think about that as it relates to some of today's conflicts. Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually worked this out diplomatically, mainly because we had missiles in Turkey on their border. And Khrushchev wanted to get rid of them as much as he wanted to have them on our border. So he finally agreed that if you take them out of Turkey, we'll take them out of Cuba. Sea power helped them because during that time, which was several days, no ship could get into Cuba and no ship could get out of Cuba. And when finally the missiles were leaving Cuba, they were stopped by U.S. Navy ships and inventory, and that was a good example of what's called trust and verify. If you're interested in the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was 50 years ago last October, an excellent book to read is called Killing Kennedy by Bill O'Reilly. It gives an in-depth understanding of that particular conflict. Remember, this is before we had a shortage of ships. Now, enforcing no-fly zones is a conflict that's come up several times in recent years. Clinton had that in Bosnia. Obama had it in Libya. Let me give you an example of whack-a-mole. Muammar Gaddafi started bombing his people who were rebelling in a civil war situation with jet strikes. And Obama and the NATO allies agreed that this was a very bad thing and they had to do something to stop it, like a no-fly zone. But when he first started dropping the bombs, there were American citizens in Libya. To get them out, we had to rent a ferry boat from Greece. That's the problem of whack-a-mole. We didn't have anybody there to do it, no naval assets were in the area. But by the time Obama and the NATO allies could agree on who was going to do what, and we agreed to take out the air defense system with cruise missiles. And NATO was going to then fly airplanes over Libya to see that their airplanes couldn't get off the ground. Now, we brought assets in because we had time. The USS Florida came in from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And we had the Kearsarge, a amphibious ship with a Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard. And they were right off the coast of Libya because they had time to get there. You look at Diego Garcia on the globe, it's a long way to Libya, but there were several days. Ships can get there in several days. They just can't get there like overnight. So we, over a 2-day period, threw 220 cruise missiles into Gaddafi's air defense system. Just as a side note, that was without any congressional approval. Now, an F-15 pilot went down in Libya due to a mechanical failure and needed to be rescued because the Libyan forces would love to catch that pilot. So the Kearsarge sent a Marine Expeditionary Unit, or part of it, in helicopters to the scene. They rescued the pilot, and Harrier jets dropped a couple of 500-pound bombs on the Libyans. This is another example of ships having time to get there, because the Kearsarge was not in the Mediterranean. At the time this started, the number of ships in the Mediterranean was one. Why was there only one ship in the Mediterranean? Whack-a-mole. The 6th Fleet was robbed to support the 7th Fleet and the 5th Fleet, because the perception was the hot spots there were hotter than they were at the time in the Mediterranean. Now, fast forward from that situation to the Benghazi incident. With Benghazi, there was some warning. It was a critical place according to the State Department's hierarchy of criticalness, but there were no Navy assets in the Mediterranean because those used earlier had gone home. This was about a year later. So when the time came for more support of Benghazi, and they got the message that they were really in trouble just about 24 hours before the attack, there just weren't any naval assets around. There was no Kearsarge. Now, fast forward to when we closed the embassy in Yemen very recently. We announced we were closing a bunch of embassies because of the threat that after Ramadan there would be attacks on many of our embassies. The warning came out of communications with Yemen. So the next day all the reporters were there on the beach in Yemen, and the cameras were focused through the reporter out in the ocean. And the reporter would say, and here's a ship to take U.S. citizens away if necessary. And there was the Kearsarge right off the coast. That's a case where it worked without whack-a-mole because the 5th Fleet is strong. There was a lot of ships available, including the Kearsarge. So she was right there with the Marine Expeditionary Unit and could have, done some necessary things if it got touchy with the embassy. These are just examples of problems when you don't have enough ships, regardless of their capability. National security is something, obviously, that if you have sea power, you have more of it than if you don't. The mutually assured destruction concept, or MAD, is nothing that's in today's foreign policy, but the fact is, with or without it, it works. When you have the ability to discharge nuclear weapons, and somebody else does, like the Soviet Union or China, what would prevent any of us from a first strike is the knowledge that we would be committing national suicide. And no rational state would do that. So the MAD concept works whether it's in your written policy statements or not. The advantage of sea power and MAD is the idea that we have ICBMs in submerged submarines. The Trident missiles from submarines that we call boomers can come out of the water from a submarine that isn't even surfaced and can travel up to 6,000 nautical miles. This missile then can separate into 10 separate targets with 10 separate warheads. Each warhead has many times the power of the atomic bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima. So we could take any country out in just a matter of moments. The advantage of sea power is that the other assets, which are Air Force assets, are ground-based bombers and missile silos. Presumably the enemy could know where they are at and try to sabotage them, but they don't know where the submarines are. The problem with MAD, and I'll get into it later, are irresponsible rogue states that may not have the sense, or terrorists who don't have a nation. If you have no nation and you're in the shadows, we can't assure that MAD has any bearing or any meaning. Also, we have preparedness for war. The United States was very unprepared for World War II, very unprepared. And having sea power and your assets deployed at all times just means that you're more prepared in the event that it happens. Also, when you have ships off somebody's shore, you can gather better intelligence than you could if you didn't. There are people in America today who would prefer that instead of having all these ships deployed, we have like a super Coast Guard and just let the rest of the world solve their problems. The problem with that is looking back at history, it's never worked. Speaking of history, I'd like to go back to about 1500 and fill you in on the situation that led us to the position that we're in. We have sea power today because of World War II, but things could have turned out much differently than they did. I mentioned earlier in civilizations way before 1500, the benefits of sea power were known, particularly in the Mediterranean. And that is, commerce begets sea power begets commerce. We saw it in the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Ottoman Empire, and the Egyptians, and the Greeks. But these were small ships, and they were unable to venture out in the great oceans. So let's start with when we begin to venture out in the great oceans. The period of wooden ships and iron men, starting about the time of Columbus's trip to the New World. Ships in those days were smaller than you'd imagine, and the seas were rougher than you'd imagine. A lot of ships went to the bottom because of Mother Nature. There were also pirates, both real pirates and authorized privateering by crowns like England, who sent out ship captains to capture other countries' ships and take their cargo. We also had rampant disease aboard ship. Very confining. It took iron men to do this. Being a sailor back in the early 1500s was characterized as like being sent to jail with a chance of being drowned. A hard life. Also, there were continual wars on the European mainland, and if two ships met on the ocean and the countries were at war on the mainland, they would shoot it out on the seas. Very dangerous place to be. Now, the countries that decided to cross the Atlantic were the obvious candidates. We had Portugal, Spain, France, the Dutch, and the English. And everybody started off with a different agenda and a different momentum. The Spanish had the early advantage, I guess because of Columbus. They started building ships faster, and their agenda was to colonize. The English and the Dutch agenda was more towards commerce, find people we could trade with. The French strategy has always been kind of schizophrenic because they were more involved in the land wars than the others, and it was hard with limited amounts of resource to support a standing army and a navy at the same time. They did engage in some colonization, and there were times that they had some incredibly strong navies, but in general, it's a history of being schizophrenic. The English in the 1500s is kind of the dark side of this whole thing of commerce. By the dark side, I mean that the English early sea captains, many of them like Hawkins and Francis Drake, were engaged in the slave trade. They would sail from England to Africa, pick up slaves and take them to the Caribbean, sell them and buy sugar with the money and come back to England where sugar was in high demand. So early on, commerce out of England was slavery and sugar. It's just a darker picture. Later that all, of course, changed. The Spanish were finding silver and gold, particularly in Peru and some other places in South America and Central America. And you've heard of the Spanish Main. The Spanish galleons were coming back laden with gold and silver. Privateering was authorized for people like Francis Drake and Hawkins by either the King or Queen of England or investment people. They would need money to fund a trip. And the captain and the crew could profit from capturing the Spanish galleon full of gold and silver, but which they'd take back to England. And the captain and the crew would get a percentage of the take. And if anybody could do that with just one ship, they would make more money with that one ship than they could in a lifetime of any other endeavor that they were qualified for. So it was very lucrative for English sea captains to do that. So the domineering navy from 1500 till about the time of the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Well, let's take from, say, Columbus's day to 1588. It's almost a century. This was dominated by Spain. They had bigger ships, more ships. But during England's golden age with Queen Elizabeth, she very shrewdly picked the right people to build ships the right people to forge the cannons, the right people to forge the cannonballs, the right people to train ship captains and recruit them, and she built up a strong navy. Meanwhile, King Philip in Spain was irritated with her for three reasons. One, she was authorizing privateering and he was losing a lot of gold and silver as a result of it. Secondly, she entered into a treaty with the Dutch. The Dutch were fighting for their independence from King Philip in Spain and represented essentially an enemy of Spain at the time because they were rebelling. That's the second reason. The third was King Philip was a flaming Catholic. Queen Elizabeth was a flaming Protestant. You might recall she's the daughter of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So King Philip decided to try a cross-channel invasion and take over England. He was going to have 55,000 troops stationed on the coast in the Netherlands and sent a fleet of about 163 ships up the channel to pick these troops up and take them in barges across the channel. Back in those days, intelligence had plenty of time to figure that out, got the word back to the Queen, so she sent her fleet of 200 ships out to meet this Spanish Armada. With Francis Drake's strategy and the weather carrying the day, they surprised the Spanish Armada from downwind and chased them up the channel. Sniping off a ship at a time, the Spanish began to realize this wasn't going to work. When they got to the coast where the troops were supposed to be, they weren't there either. So when the Spanish Armada was defeated, a little misleading, it didn't prevent the invasion because it couldn't have occurred anyway. The guy that was supposed to get the 55,000 troops there reneged on the deal because he was having a tiff with King Philip. As they had to go on up the channel and come back around, the weather scuttled most of the ships. So the Spanish Armada comes back with half the ships they left with. There were only 60 ships made it back to Spain. Now this was a big shot in the arm for the British and a humiliating defeat for the Spanish, but this didn't result in a long-term outcome to England's advantage. England had a day in the sun from 1588 until 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died. She was replaced by King James, who was a bit of a peacenik. He engineered a treaty with Spain, and the British Navy went downhill fast. During that time, the Spanish were still rebuilding their fleet, and this gave a tremendous advantage to the Dutch because they were rebelling against Spain. And given the freedom of the Spanish defeat and the time involved, they were able to build up a huge navy. And the Dutch dominated the waves from that time for about 6 decades until about 1688. During that time, the example of Dutch supremacy is a great example of commerce begets sea power begets commerce begets sea power. The Dutch built an incredibly prosperous society and had, their day in the sun. But King James was replaced by King Charles. Charles wanted to build the British Navy back up. England went through a little internal civil war, and Charles was replaced by Oliver Cromwell, who was not royalty, but the winner of the Civil War. Cromwell continued to build the British Navy up until it was big enough to take on the Dutch in 3 wars called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Meanwhile, while England was getting supremacy back from the Dutch, the French were building up a huge navy under Louis XIV. Since 1500 in history, there are 3 people who tried to take over the entire European continent, including England. The first was Louis XIV, then Napoleon, and then Hitler. Louis XIV put together a navy bigger than England's and decided, like King James had done, or King Philip in Spain had done, he put together an awesome sized fleet and intended to go up, do a cross-channel invasion and defeat England. The problem was that England figured out they could lose, so they entered into a treaty with the Dutch. So the English and the Dutch navies combined to defeat Louis XIV's French fleet just off the Cotentin Peninsula near Normandy. In 1692, the French suffered a severe defeat at the hands of the combined fleet of the English and the Dutch. Basically, from that date on, England ruled the waves. But they were challenged mightily during the time of Napoleon, which is characterized as the whale versus the elephant. Following the French Revolution, Napoleon was the head of all the military for a while, and he decided in 1798 that he wanted desperately to do a cross-channel invasion. He knew he couldn't handle it with the existing size of the British Navy. So he came up with a kind of outside the nine dots thinking. He said, I'll take Egypt and I'll dig a canal into the Red Sea. I'll cut the sailing time to India and China by 2/3, but I won't let the British use the canal. He takes 160,000 troops down to Egypt and is trying to pull this caper off. But the English figured out he was up to something, and they sent Horatio Nelson as the admiral with an English fleet down to the Mediterranean and said, find Napoleon and destroy his fleet. Well, the Mediterranean looks small on a map, but when you're there trying to find somebody else and you don't have satellites and radar, it took him a long time. He finally smoked out Napoleon at the mouth of the Nile River in Egypt. There were 17 warships at anchorage. Nelson came in, swooped down each side, caught them in a crossfire, and sunk 15 of the ships. Napoleon was lucky to get out of it alive, stranded the French army, and was humiliated in defeat. The admiral, the French admiral, remember this name was Villanueva. Okay? Napoleon goes back to France, and instead of being in charge of the military, winds up being in charge of the entire country. He has always wanted to defeat the British Navy. He's always wanted to conquer the whole continent. He's always wanted to occupy and control England. He comes up with an incredibly sophisticated plot, because he was good at that, of how to trick the British Navy into thinking he was going to the Caribbean, and he would meanwhile sneak up the Channel. He planned meticulously to have thousands of troops on the coast across from England, had ammunition, horses, everything that you'd need. England, having plenty of time to figure out he was up to something, sent Horatio Nelson out again, who'd been vacationing in Italy, to destroy the French fleet. It took him a long time to figure out the ruse, but eventually he did. And when the French fleet started north up the Channel, Horatio Nelson attacked with the wind at his advantage and destroyed Napoleon's fleet, sunk 2/3 of his ship without any British losses. Now, the British ships were beat to a pulp, but they didn't sink, whereas he sunk 2/3 of the French fleet. This is the most famous battle in English history and made Horatio Nelson the biggest war hero of Britain all time. But it didn't prevent the invasion, as you might think, because as the ships were going up the Channel, Napoleon was getting threatened by the Prussians in a land war, and he sucked all the troops away from the Netherlands and sent them over to fight the Prussians. So if he hadn't been defeated there, there still would not have been an invasion. But if you read casually a history book, you'll see reference to the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the defeat of Napoleon as milestones to protect England, when in fact they were great naval victories, but there probably never would have been an invasion. So if you look at from 1500 to 1692, the final defeat of the French fleet, what we have is a history of British domination interrupted by Dutch domination, starting off with Spanish domination. The French never really had control of the oceans. From time to time they had a great navy, many famous battles with all the other countries at sea. France was a player, they just never had total domination of the sea. If you look at all that's happened in that time frame, you begin to get the picture that England was favored because they were an island. Being an island, they didn't have to have a huge, expensive standing army the way all the other countries did. All the countries on the mainland had to have a very expensive standing army and build ships. It takes a lot of money to do that. Over a long period of time, the domination of the British Navy was due to geography. The final battle was the Battle of Trafalgar that I mentioned, where 2/3 of the French fleet sank. Now, Napoleon met his end later at Waterloo. After his defeat at Trafalgar, he decided, well, I'm not going to be able to conquer England. I'll take care of the rest of the agenda in the continent. So he attacked Russia. Remember, when I talk about Hitler, that the same thing happened to Hitler that happened to Napoleon. He couldn't conquer the Channel, so he invaded Russia. The same thing happened with Hitler, except it was the Royal Air Force that he couldn't defeat. After Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, he checked himself in and surrendered to a British warship and asked for asylum in England. Before his death, he wrote his memoirs and credited the British Navy with being the group that he just could never defeat. This is a picture because there weren't any photographers in those days. This is a painting. They always sent a few artists out to look things over. This is Horatio Nelson's warship called the Victory. The Victory was a real killing machine. The Victory had 3 levels of cannons. See the
3 levels of cannons.
3 levels of cannons. There was approximately 100 cannons on the ship. They could send out 1,000 pounds of lead a minute. And all the ship captains of the day, because it was tradition, stood on the bridge, pretty much easy targets for all this flying lead. This is a bigger picture of the Battle at Trafalgar. I'm sure you've heard the expression, the fog of war. I think it started here. Nelson was killed in the battle, and this is a picture on the deck of the Victory of Horatio Nelson's death. The all-time British hero. If you've been to London, there's Trafalgar Square and a statue of Nelson with his missing arm and his missing eye. He was missing an arm and an eye when he went to the Battle of the Nile. This is because ship captains were susceptible to flying lead. This entered in an era, really starting at 1805 after Trafalgar rather than the defeat of Napoleon. But the British Navy ruled the waves essentially for a century. And their day in the sun was until about 1900. In 1890, they controlled 1/5 of the land surface. The Great Britain. You've heard the expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire. They controlled 1/5 of the land surface and had more shipping than every other nation combined. That's a pretty powerful statistic. Now, during this century, all navies went through an evolution: wood to steel, sail to steam, cannons to long guns. Torpedoes were perfected from submarines, which had been invented far earlier, but the use with torpedoes was being perfected, and launching airplanes from ships. This occurred in the early 1900s. The United States' first adventure of flying an airplane off a ship was in San Francisco Bay in 1911. The Brits had done it a little earlier. Pax Britannica is Latin for happy days in London. This is a great example of sea power begets commerce, begets sea power. And what made England so strong in this time frame was its trade with America, which actually started in around 1700. Classic example. So we've seen Spain, the Dutch, and England go through tremendous prosperity due to sea power. This is a map of the world at 1890, and the red is the British Empire. I told you that they control 1/5 of the Earth's surface. When you look at that, you're thinking maybe that's not 1/5. The problem, this isn't a globe, this is a Mercator projection. And these longitude lines say that you take a globe and pretend it's rubber, and then take 4 corners and pin it up, so you're stretching, exaggerating anything near the poles, and everything on the equator is perfectly correct. If you look at the United States, visualize how big do you think the state of Texas is? Well, Greenland is 3 times as big as Texas, but here, with half of Greenland cut off, it looks like it's 20 times bigger than Texas. That's the exaggeration of the Mercator projection. Also, Russia and Siberia aren't that big either. They're big, but not that big. So this really is a fifth of the Earth's surface belonging to the British Empire. And with all that trade going on, it was prosperous times. But that is about to come to an end. 1890, the same time that British hit its zenith and was enjoying the great fruits of sea power, there was a book written, actually a white paper for the Naval Academy in Newport, Rhode Island. Alfred Mahan wrote a book in 1890 called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Very, very influential, powerful book. In it, he documented with great research the benefits of sea power, commerce sea power cycle. And he credited the existence of the British Empire to its sea power. You'd think that might have been obvious, but it wasn't. The book was enlightening and revolutionary. And now we have good news, bad news, and mixed news. First, the good news. Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, and he attended the seminar at the War College. When the book became published, he gave it to every politician he could give it to and made it required reading within the Navy. Due to his influence, the President McKinley actually expanded our naval forces a bit. And in 1898, when the battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, which today historians don't agree on why it blew up, everybody assumed it was Spain, the Spanish. So McKinley, at Roosevelt's urging, declared war on Spain. Roosevelt communicated with Admiral Perry in Hong Kong, where there was a U.S. fleet, had them go over to Manila and defeat the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, which Perry did without a single loss, did it before breakfast and wiped out the entire Spanish fleet. Later, off the coast of Cuba, we won another famous naval battle at Santiago Bay. Meanwhile, Roosevelt leaves his office as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, forms the Rough Riders and goes to Cuba, fights on horseback at the Battle of San Juan Hill. This all resulted in Spain being defeated. Treaties were signed. We wound up with the Philippines as a protectorate, Guam and Puerto Rico. Cuba won their independence. That's the bottom line on that conflict. But Roosevelt, then becoming a civilian, went back and ran for governor of New York and won. Then when McKinley was ready to run for a second term, he wanted a different vice president. He selected Roosevelt. They won the election. McKinley is immediately assassinated. This puts Roosevelt in the White House. Roosevelt, once he was in the White House, began to build his dream of a great Navy from the book, The Influence of Sea Power in History. He built something he calls the Great White Fleet. 16 battleships that he had painted white and sent them around the world in 1908 on an intimidation cruise called the Goodwill Cruise. What he was doing was letting the world know that the United States was a big, influential naval power. 1908. Now, I said good news, bad news, and mixed news. Let's go down to the bad news. Kaiser Wilhelm read the book, loved it, decided that if England could have done that, we could do it. We'll do it through the North Sea. All we have to do is defeat the British Navy. So he passes the German Navy Act of 1898, starts shipbuilding like crazy. Now, back to the mixed news, Japan. Japan read the book. It became required reading in the Navy and Army hierarchy in Japan. The feeling in Japan was, we're an island the same size as England. We're off a continent, much like the European continent, the Asian continent. We could have done this, but we can still do it. So they began to build a Navy. They started in 1894 by defeating the China Navy, which was far inferior at the time. And this started them on a path towards building their Navy up. They were getting at the time tremendous encouragement from Roosevelt. Roosevelt would meet with the Spanish envoys in Washington and encouraged them to continue to build their sea power as he was. Now let's talk a little bit about England in 1900. And as I describe it, think about the United States today. England, 1900. The treasury was broke. This was because of the Boer Wars in South Africa. My historian here is nodding his head. Cliff keeps me honest on history. The Boer Wars were very expensive for England. The citizens of England were tired of war. They were war weary. The treasury was depleted. The voters in England were more interested in entitlements. They were saying that we want what we would call in America today Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. The British Parliament was noticing the buildup of Kaiser Wilhelm and the German Navy Act, and they said, look, we're out of money. The Germans are going to threaten us. It's close to home. We've got to cut costs. We're going to pull in our horns. We will cede the Western Pacific to Japan. We'll cede the Eastern Pacific and the Western Atlantic to the United States. We can trust the United States. We know that they're good guys. We'll monitor Japan. We hope they're going to be good guys. They entered into a treaty in 1902 with Japan. In this treaty, England agreed to go to Japan and send all their experts over there. They coached Japan on how to build ships, how to fly airplanes off ships, Navy protocol, Navy tactics, everything. The English became very entwined with the Japanese during this time period, and the Japanese decided to take on the Russians in 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. In a naval battle over who was going to control Korea, they defeated a Russian fleet. Roosevelt gave them attaboys, England gave them attaboys, and they were beginning to really feel their oats in Japan. Roosevelt, as a sidebar, actually got a Nobel Peace Prize for engineering the treaty between Japan and Russia at the end of that conflict. Japan's attitude at that time was, we can do it. We can do all the things that sea power gave Great Britain. We can do that ourselves. And the feeling in Germany was, all we got to do is get out through the North Sea, defeat the British Navy. What we have is the seeds of World War II were planted. Japan and Germany felt that it was their destiny to enlarge their footprint on the globe. And what later turned into what we know as World War II, those seeds were planted and fertilized. But wait, World War I hasn't been fought yet. This is a picture of the Connecticut, one of the ships in the Great White Fleet that went around the world in 1908. He had them all painted white as a kind of showmanship thing. World War I, 1914 to 1918. As I go through this, remember that the United States was on the sidelines until 1917. So we weren't involved in the early part of this war. The first thing that happens is Japan declares war on Germany. I meet so many Americans who had no idea Japan was involved in World War I, much less on our side as an ally. So they started with the siege of Tsingtao, I probably am not pronouncing it right, in 1914. It was a naval exercise that went down with 6 battleships and laid siege to a German port in China. China was kind of a doormat at the time, and the Germans had taken over one of the big ports there and using it as a German base. They blockaded them, and I mention this because it's the first use of airplanes off ships in combat rather than training. The British had taught the Japanese how to do it, and they had planes going off these ships, dropping bombs on the German port, and I believe it's the first time in history that was done in combat. It had been done in training exercises. Japan carried the day, took many German prisoners to Japan, and by the way, they were treated very nicely, unlike World War II. Meanwhile, Kaiser Wilhelm, during that time frame, builds 351 submarines, a stunning figure, and sunk 5,000 Allied ships, another stunning figure. In 1915, well, first off, the Kaiser started off sinking English warships. Then he went to merchant ships carrying war cargo. Finally, he ratcheted up and went to anything that would float. When he got up to anything that would float, he sank the Lusitania. I run into so many people who think that's why we got in World War I. It wasn't. It was 2 full years from the sinking of the Lusitania until we declared war on Germany. 1916 was the biggest naval battle that had ever taken place on the face of Europe. 100 German ships and about 120 English ships, about 16 of which were the big, humongous battleships, fought off the coast of Denmark, and it's called the Battle of Jutland. This was the climax of the Kaiser's buildup of a big navy, and the fact that the British had drawn in their horns and put all their focus on the North Sea. This was a huge naval engagement, but inconclusive. This was long-range battleships trying to hit each other as moving targets, 15, 16 miles away. A lot more shells went in the water than actually hit anything. And at the end of the day, Britain had lost 6,000 sailors, Germany 2,500. Germany sank about 4 more ships than the Brits, so propaganda-wise it was a German victory. The British knew they had some learning to do. The Germans went back to port. They couldn't break out of the North Sea, and they realized that battleships weren't the way to do this. So the Kaiser went back to his submarine strategy, and after Jutland he said, we're going back to anything that floats. He sunk a ton of ships after Jutland. When we did finally end the war, the U.S. Navy, the Japanese Navy, and the British Navy had to learn in a quick hurry anti-submarine warfare. And Japan sent a lot of ships to the Mediterranean to fight German submarines there, and the U.S. and Britain concentrated on the North Sea. After the declaration of war, our Assistant Secretary of the Navy hustled around and got 33 destroyers dispatched immediately to the North Sea. As a little bit of trivia, that Assistant Secretary of the Navy that did that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The bottom line of World War I is, from a naval point of view, is all the militaries learned that submarines and launching airplanes off ships was the way of the future. The era of big battleships was coming to an end. The reason is torpedoes are cheap, and you can sink an entire battleship with one of them. And airplanes can go out and drop bombs further than they can shoot shells out of long guns. So the day of the battleship was beginning to come to an end, and that was the important learning lesson of World War I. As I mentioned, it was a dress rehearsal for World War II. This marked the real decline of Great Britain as a naval power. Their treasury was kaput at the end of World War I. This spawned something called the Washington Naval Conference in 1921. It is said that more ships were lost in that conference than in any naval battle in history. England and the United States agreed to dramatically reduce the size of their navy. Every politician in the British Parliament believed that there would never be another war. The politicians in Washington believed that there might be another war, but if there is, we don't want to participate. The Japanese came prepared with demands, and they wanted to continue to build their navy. They were forced into a negotiation where they could agree to only 3/5 of the size of their navy compared to either the United States or Great Britain. Making a huge concession in that agreement on ship numbers, Japan insisted on some geographic concessions with formerly held German possessions in the Western Pacific. They were denied, and those possessions were given to, the traditional powers in Europe, such as France and England. The Japanese were incensed after this conference. They were told to keep their navy small and that they had no fruits from their participation in World War I. Many people believe that the attitude of Japan turned hostile at that moment, and they ignored the treaty. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles was so punitive that it allowed Hitler to take power, and that and some other factors. And Hitler immediately ignored the Treaty of Versailles. The thinking amongst historians is that this naval conference and the Treaty of Versailles set the stage for World War II. World War II. A lot happened before Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, September 1. Most people that I talk to believe that that started the war. I don't realize that anything much happened before that. The reason is all Americans at the time, most of them came from European descendants. They were very interested in Europe, and the news carried all the headlines about things happening in Europe. Americans didn't care that much about Africa or Asia. Let me click off a few things that happened before Poland. Japan invades Manchuria. Japan invades all the China ports. Mussolini invades Egypt using chemical weapons, killing thousands of Ethiopians. Hitler annexes Austria and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and Japan invades Mongolia in 1939 in a little town called Namanan. If you're interested in this battle after I describe it, if you Google Namanan, it'll send you to another site, because that little town has several different names depending on whether you were Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, or Russian. Nonetheless, it was a big battle. This is not a little skirmish. 1939, May, before Hitler invaded Poland, the Japanese army came up with a concept called the North Strike Group, and they sold Tokyo on the notion that they would proceed with the strength of the Japanese army north through Mongolia into Siberia and capture huge sections of Siberia, which was rich in iron ore and other minerals that Japan wanted. This was their first attempt at a bigger footprint. They needed imports, they needed raw materials. So the army struck at that town in 1939 in May. A battle raged for 3 months. The losses of Japan were estimated at 44,000, never confirmed at the end of the war. The Russian losses were confirmed at the end of the war. They lost 8,000 lives and 15,000 injured. Very significant battle. The winner from the Red Army point of view was Gregory Zhukov. Zhukov was sent back to Moscow by Stalin and given so many medals he walked like this. He became an instant hero. This is a very significant battle because the Japanese army goes back to Tokyo with their tail between their legs and said, you can kind of forget the North Strike Group, it ain't going to work. Japan then enters into what I call power flowing into a vacuum. When the army was defeated, the Navy went into the vacuum. The Navy then dominated thinking in Tokyo and said, let's form something called the South Strike Group. The Navy plan was we'll go down and take the Philippines, Indochina, maybe Australia, certainly Singapore, and we will get all the rich natural resources of those countries, and we'll be in the Catbird Sea. So that was a sale that they made, but they huddled over the charts and studied it and said, what could go wrong? And somebody pointed out, well, maybe the U.S. Navy would be a problem. And that caused them to hatch this Pearl Harbor plot. It all goes back to that battle in Namanan where the Japanese army lost their mojo. Now this was significant in many regards. One is that Pearl Harbor was a strategic blunder on the part of the Japanese, which eventually brought about the end of Japan and Hitler. Also, there was a thing called the Tripartite Act, signed by Japan, Italy, and Germany, where they all agreed to not fight with anybody unless they were all going to, and to form a kind of a common bond. And in that treaty, they excluded Russia. So the reason that Stalin brought all the divisions off the Japanese front back to defend Moscow was because he knew Japan had given up. Now, the largest land battle ever fought was the Battle of Moscow. You can't find it in history books because there wasn't a clear winner. But it was one of the largest land battles ever fought. And that was when Hitler decided, as Napoleon, he couldn't take England, I'd attack Russia. He decided to head for Moscow and almost got there. Hitler, in 1941, gets almost to Moscow. He's within a 9-iron shot of Moscow. And the reason he didn't finally take it was because of Zhukov's strategy and the divisions that had come from the Japanese front. So that little simple battle had a lot of meaning. It caused Pearl Harbor, and it caused Hitler to not take Moscow. Things could be a lot different if the Japanese army had defeated the Red Army there and proceeded north into Siberia. These are the funny little twists and turns in history that I just love to read about. Pearl Harbor was also a mistake on the tactical level. strategic blunder huge. When Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor after the attack, he was in charge of the whole Pacific theater. He was led around and looked at all the damage, and he said, we can take advantage of this. They made 3 tactical blunders. First off, they struck on Sunday. If they'd struck during the week, the death toll would have been 4 times as big. That's because all sailors want to show on Sunday. Secondly, they didn't hit the fuel dumps, so we can still fuel our carriers, which weren't hit because they weren't in port. The third blunder was they didn't hit the dry docks. And Nimitz said, we'll get most of these ships up and back in service within a short time. If they hit the dry docks, we'd have to tow them to America for repairs. So we were back in the game pretty quickly with submarines and carriers because neither were damaged at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's priorities after he declared war on Germany, after they declared war on us, which they did because of the Tripartite Act, Roosevelt decided that defeating Hitler was more important than defeating Japan. He put all of the resources he could on the European theater and turned the Pacific more or less over to the Navy. There were Army elements at the Philippines, but they were under attack and weren't in very good shape. So it was basically a Navy and Marine battle in World War II. Now the strategy used in the Pacific was Admiral King's strategy as the head Navy guy at the time in Washington, D.C. He took a string on the globe and ran it from Los Angeles to the northern tip of Australia. And he said, we have to have the sea lanes open to Australia because we think the Japanese will try to take Australia. They already could see that they were taking the Philippines and Singapore. So his strategy was, don't let them penetrate that line. If they do, that's where we'll have to attack. This is why World War II in the Pacific started with the Battle of the Coral Sea. And this is why the Marines first landed at Guadalcanal, because that was where they penetrated Admiral King's line. The strategy then was to island hop, capturing airstrips that the Japanese were using to destroy their air capacity and bring in our planes instead. And as they would continue to island hop, eventually they get to where they could bring in long-range bombers, which they eventually did. So Navy and Marines were in charge of that strategy. And by the way, we do have a Marine hero in our midst here tonight. And before you all leave tonight, I'd like for you to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Lionel Lopes, right here, stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima, Saipan, and Tinian. You might want to thank him for his service. The purpose of taking those islands was for air power. And we lost a lot of Marines in the process. But eventually we got B-29s in, and our submarines and B-29s won the war in the Pacific. B-29s destroyed Tokyo. Berlin, at the end of World War II, lost 50 square miles of Berlin. And you heard about all the bombing that took place from England on Berlin. Tokyo lost 250 square miles. A little bit bigger scope of bombing. The reason is that most Japanese homes were cardboard or wood. And the Army Air Corps was dropping incendiary bombs that were causing massive fires. Now between the bombing strategy of the B-29s and the fact that our submarines were sinking every piece of merchant shipping in and out of Japan, they were starving to death. They couldn't get the imports into Japan. They couldn't get the exports out to the islands where the troops were. So they were basically strangled to death by submarines and then set on fire by the B-29s. The atomic bombs were only used to get the emperor to agree to an unconditional surrender because he showed every sign of not doing that. When he finally agreed to do it after the atomic bombs, he saved millions of Japanese lives as well as millions of U.S. lives. The bottom line is that we outfought and outmanufactured the Axis powers, which is why we won World War II. Just look at some of these numbers. This is our merchant marine and Navy production 1935 to 1945. We built 2,547 amphibious ships. think of the big things that went up and opened like a clamshell and a bunch of tanks would come out. The little tiny Higgins boats that carried the Marines to the shore, they're not in that count. There were 2,500 of them too, but not up here on the count. At the end of World War II, Eisenhower said that this was a team effort. Everybody pulled together, but we could not have won the war without Higgins. Higgins was a manufacturer of the Higgins boat in New Orleans. And if you ever get to New Orleans, make sure you see the museum. They're dedicated to the Higgins boats. Liberty ships, 2,500 of them. I saw a Hugh Hauser episode where he interviewed the people that did this up in San Francisco Bay. They were grinding out a Liberty ship every 4 days. Unbelievable. The Japanese and the Germans never anticipated the rate at which we could manufacture stuff. 350 destroyers, 200 submarines. This is awesome. 27 carriers. This is our aircraft production for the Navy only. Stunning numbers. Stunning numbers. 1943, 20,000 ships. Total aircraft production. This is the Army, Air Corps, and the Navy of ourselves without the Allies compared to Japan and Germany. Meanwhile, there was the British production and the Russian production that's not shown here. But the United States alone outproduced both opponents in total aircraft production. As I mentioned, World War II is when our Navy got so big, we just decided since we've got sea power, we'll keep it. So we've had it ever since then. We've kept and expanded the Navy to control the oceans. The main reason was the Cold War. We wanted to stay ahead of Russia, and we got into a race with Russia that ended during the Reagan administration when they finally threw in the towel, basically because the communist economic model couldn't keep up with the capitalist model. They just couldn't keep spending that much money on the arms race. And we had to support 2 more Pacific Wars in Korea and Vietnam, so we needed that naval power. Current problems, budget cuts following the end of the Cold War. Anytime there's an event like this in U.S. politics, every politician wants to take advantage of something called the peace dividend. And the number of ships in the Navy from the Reagan administration to today is half what it was. And every president, Democrat or Republican, has participated in a systematic reduction of the number of Navy ships. In the presidential debates, Romney tried to lay that at Obama's doorstep, but basically every president since Reagan has participated in that. That's not to say that Obama favors a bigger Navy, because he doesn't. He's a bit of a peacenik and is kind of forced into some things he wishes he wasn't, because Obama ran on a domestic agenda and his interest is domestic. But he wasn't responsible for all that decline. Every president has been responsible for it. As a result, with less ships, less operations, less maintenance, less training, these just continue to create problems. And in addition to budget cuts that were planned, we have the sequester laid in on top of the budget cuts. The problem with the sequester is there are certain parts of the defense budget that are exempt from sequester, which makes the flat percentage used apply to a smaller part of the budget, which is the operational piece. So the severeness of the sequester is very problematic for the Navy. We're also experiencing infrastructure decay. As there are less ships being built, there's less competition in shipbuilding. Some shipbuilding locations are closing down. Also, some of the parts that supply the shipbuilders, since there's so few ships being built, we have monopolies. And once you have a monopoly, you can delay the delivery of stuff, nobody really cares, and you can establish a price that's much higher than if there was competition. Ships are being built all over the world today, but not too many in America. So infrastructure decay is a problem. We're now faced with a China threat. I'll give you some statistics at the end of the talk, but China is quickly building up a huge navy, almost the size of ours today, and there's no end in sight. And the budget increases that they have in mind are pretty awesome. China is pretty well stated with rhetoric that they want hegemony in the Western Pacific. They want to control the Western Pacific. The problem is we don't know what they really want. You've heard the expression, the inscrutable Chinese. They're hard to figure out. If you listen to their rhetoric, they want to go back to some navigational charts in the 40s that show that a bunch of islands belong to China that Japan and the Philippines think belong to them. And the rivalry there is intense. All of our allies are frightened because they don't know what China's real intention is. So far, we're trying to keep it peaceful with diplomacy. We're working with the Chinese. The Chinese Navy is participating with us in Somalia, trying to defeat pirates from Somalia. They're getting experience of having a fleet far from their home borders for the first time, learning how problematic the logistics are. Having fleets across the whole globe are something we're used to handling the logistics of because we've been doing it for 100 years. But it's kind of new to them. What's changing? We have more budget cuts, decline in numbers, but increase in effectiveness. Each ship is more powerful. There are carrier strike groups, and we have submarines and the Marines. And if you'll notice in the mission shift towards asymmetric warfare, which is warfare against countries that are kind of puny in strength compared to us, but nonetheless are giving us fits. You'll see the word unmanned 3 times. That's because the Navy is working very hard to create unmanned things in the air, the surface, and below the sea. This is a force multiplier from any particular ship who can send out unmanned things and expand their area of control. The problem, budget-wise, is that these carriers, as they get about 50 years old, are wearing out and need to be replaced, and they're very expensive nuclear-powered large carriers. Currently, the Gerald R. Ford class is scheduled to begin that process of replacing these old carriers. You may have heard that the Enterprise was recently decommissioned and taken out of service. That was the first of the great nuclear-powered carriers. As each one begins to wear out, it'll be more expensive to replace them. We're also replacing our planes that fly off the carriers with the new F-35C. I got some pictures to show you later on that. Submarines, same thing. They have to be replaced after so many years. Very expensive process. Asymmetric warfare is giving us problems. Our thinkers are deciding that the next war won't look anything like the last war, and that it could be something like Iran blocking the Straits of Hormuz with mines. They threatened to do it. They said it would be easy. You might remember on TV that the head of the Iranian Navy said it would be as easy to seal off the Straits of Hormuz as drinking a glass of water. Remember that on the news? So we don't have the mine countermeasure ships that we used to because we put a lot of money into deep water ships. So because of that, we're going to develop combat ships that have shallow drafts and can go in close to shore and have mine countermeasure potential. So I'll show you some photos in just a minute. The Marines are going to return to their amphibious roots. The Marines have been fighting in land wars because they're tremendous fighters and they've been available. But their roots go back to the kinds of fighting that took place in World War II. You're going to see more and more of them going back to that so that they can have this quick strike force of Marines that are close to some of these hot spots, some of them on ships that can get in a little closer to the shore. Just to show you the decline in the Navy from 1945 to today, these are incredible declines. If you tried to get this column of numbers to add to the 285 ships I told you that we had, it doesn't add up. Don't try to do that, but let's take it as an example. The 56 here is the total submarines, which is the sum of 14 and 42. The surface warships down here of 122 is the sum of those things. So that doesn't add to 285, but trust me, that's about the number of ships that we have. Far less than 1,267 that we used to have. One of our main weapons to make people shake in their boots so that we can be diplomatic with them is the carrier strike group, which is an aircraft carrier, a cruiser with long-range missiles, a couple of destroyers with anti-aircraft missiles, and a submarine to destroy hostile ships, and a supply ship. Today's supply ships carry both ammunition, fuel, and supplies. When I was in the Navy, you had a separate ship to do each one of those things. This is the Nimitz, which is now the oldest carrier still active in the fleet, and all the other carriers are called the Nimitz class. The Gerald R. Ford class that will eventually replace these will probably be put on hold and delayed by budget cuts and sequestration. The Gerald R. Ford will cost a lot more than this did. That's because it's much higher tech, much more savvy equipment on it, and it will no longer use the steam catapult launch. They're going to use electromagnetic propulsion. It's just an entirely bunch of new high-tech concepts. This Nimitz class is as big as the Empire State Building. 6,000 people aboard when the air wings are on. It has everything that you need in a community of 6,000 people. It has jails, churches, a court system, a bunch of little Walmarts. It has everything a city would need. Huge, huge ship. If you've never been aboard a carrier, I suggest you go down to San Diego and look at the Midway. Primitive by this size, but it gives you a feeling for how big these things are. This is the Super Hornet. That's the mainstay of the air fleet that flies off carriers today. Is Andy in the room? Yeah. My son-in-law took this picture at an air show, which superimposes a World War II plane with the Super Hornet. Sure. I asked Andy how he did that because it looks like he's up in an airplane too. I discovered when I went to the next air show with him that they dipped a fort in front of the audience just so you can take that kind of picture. This is the new F-35C, C meaning for the Navy. B is for the Marine Corps, and A is for the Air Force and allied countries that we want to sell it to. This ship is stealthy, meaning not detectable on radar. It is much more powerful than Super Hornet, but it's fraught with problems that make it very expensive, and Congress is questioning this right today. And I see some delays in the delivery of the F-35. That means some of the Super Hornets are going to have to be modified, upgraded, and maintained a little bit better. This is the F-35B, the Marine version, which does vertical landing and a shorter launch. They can launch without a catapult off just the tip end of the carrier. This is a vertical landing. If it was a horizontal landing, obviously the cameraman would have been killed. This is a vertical landing. This is going to be sold to the Brits to replace their Harrier jets. This is the new X-47B, an experimental number. Eventually it would get different nomenclature. This is an unmanned aircraft landing on the George H.W. Bush just a few months ago. This thing looks like a little miniature B-2 bomber, doesn't it? It's stealthy, can't be detected on radar, but it's not very big. Just to put it in football field terms for you, if you stood on the main line of the ship out to the wingspan, that's the first down. If you took the first down chains, that gives you a feeling of how tiny this thing is compared to the B-2 bomber, but it does look like one, doesn't it? Now this thing is way more sophisticated and powerful than the Predator drone. This thing is capable of launching off a carrier, performing a mission, coming back and landing without any human intervention. The Predator drone has a guy up in Las Vegas with a joystick controlling everything. Nobody on the carrier's controlling it. It is smart enough to handle problems, get around them, and complete its mission without any human intervention. It carries 4,500 pounds of ordnance and has a 2,000 nautical mile range. It can do a round trip. The expectations are high. There are people in the Navy who think this could be the end of manned aircraft. The advantage being manned aircraft takes hundreds of thousands of dollars to train a pilot who might leave after his obligation or stay and have health care and pensions for life. This is a bargain compared to a manned aircraft. Also, guess what? The carrier doesn't have to be as big. A much smaller, less expensive carrier could support this type of aircraft. This is a much smaller unmanned aircraft, the Puma. This is a joint venture with the Army and the Navy, but this thing will handle seawater, land in the ocean, very inexpensive, only $300,000. Takes very accurate, high-definition pictures and gives live video feedback to the ship. So that's that expansion of what the ship's capable of to know what the heck's going on. The new LCS, called a Littoral Combat Ship, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's pronounced littoral. If you talk to anybody in the Navy, they pronounce it littoral. So so I'm going to try to start saying littoral. The definition is it's close to shore. It's built with a shallow draft so it can get in tight. The notion is that we've got a lot of asymmetric warfare in front of us where they'll have small diesel, battery, diesel electric powered submarines. They're quieter than atomic submarines and can handle shallow waters and even rivers. So we've got to be able to get in close. And this ship is designed to have modules. It has a separate module that will go aboard to do mine countermeasures, a different module for surface problems like small swarming ships from the Iranian Navy, or discharging SEAL teams and Marines. The speed is incredible. I put 60 knots question mark because we never publish the top speed of anything. It's always classified. I believe that these things are capable of 60 knots. By the way, if you Google USS Independence or the Freedom, there are YouTube videos showing the ship's captains in the bridge, and I describe these things in great detail. It has a large helicopter deck, weapons laden with these modules. Could be a ship of the future. This is a picture of the Independence. It's a trimaran hull, 3 separate hulls. Hard to see in this picture, but it has 3 hulls. It's doing a 90-degree turn without a bow wave. They're fast little things. Turbojet, diesel-powered engines, capable of obviously carrying helicopters. This is only a 40-man crew, and you can't take these back and forth across the Pacific. They want them in the Pacific. The ocean is too big to keep running them back and forth, so they're going to use a concept called the blue crew, gold crew, like they do with boomer submarines. An entire crew will be assigned to it, and then a new crew will come in and replace the entire old crew. This could be a big problem because militaries can inherit what's called a rental car mentality. I don't care what shape it's in when I leave. So the jury's out on whether or not that'll work. There are 2 hull versions. This is a trimaran. There's a single hull version, the Freedom, built at 2 different shipyards. Perhaps competition's good, but nonetheless, the Congress is questioning why would the Navy have 2 different ship types. It doesn't sound economical. It seems like they could grind out more if they were all the same. So this is going on right now with Congress. So this is a very controversial ship. The first one is already in Singapore operation. This is an unmanned surface vehicle, experimental. Can go up rivers and do things very close into the shore, gather intelligence, stuff like that. This is an underwater unmanned thing called the Kingfish. This is, these are civilians launching it off a ship. It could be launched off a submarine or a ship, either one. It can go underwater, detect mines, and take care of them by cutting the cables, pops them to the surface, or exploding them. But it's basically a mine countermeasure device. This is the new Joint High-Speed Vehicle. It's a catamaran hull, longer than a football field, can carry about 400 troops, airline style, or about 150 sleepovers. It can carry the big Abrams tank. It's intended for very high-speed, rapid ways to get Marines and soldiers to the battlefield in a quick hurry in a zone. So these will most likely be eventually deployed in the Pacific. The first one has been delivered to the Little Creek Amphibious Base in Virginia, where I used to serve once, and Marines are experimenting with it. On the horizon, strategic cooperation with 22 allied navies. When you're running out of ships, the first thing you do is try to partner with people that you can get on your side to perform the same mission. And if you read the papers, we're doing a lot of that specifically with allies in the Pacific region, because that's where our current thrust is, the pivot to the Pacific. So we're doing all kinds of exercises with Australia and Japan, and now the Philippines have invited us back into the Philippines after kicking us out in 1991. More laser weapons as the science evolves. I have some pictures. Competition in the Arctic Ocean. The ice melt on the North Pole has caused the Arctic to be the Northwest Passage that everybody used to seek. And the potential of the Arctic Ocean is great in oil and natural gas. Everybody's interested in it. All the countries that have a coastline on the Arctic Arctic Ocean have signed a treaty except for us. We haven't signed it yet. And of course, with Alaska, we're on the Arctic coast. We need to sign that treaty and get involved. We attend the meetings, but we don't have much of a voice yet. China is very interested in the Arctic Ocean, and they're already buying mining leases in Greenland. Greenland is a protectorate of Denmark, and Denmark used to support them financially. Denmark is now cutting the ties that bind financially and telling the island, you're on your own. So they're selling their raw materials to the highest bidder, and China is the highest bidder. You're going to see a lot of Chinese mining on the north coast of Greenland and being able to take it through the short route across the ocean down to China. China's economy is growing so fast they need raw materials like crazy, rare minerals, iron ore, all that stuff. Electromagnetic pulse is one of our potential biggest enemies. This would be like worse than Pearl Harbor. It would be Pearl Harbor times 100. An electromagnetic pulse is a phenomenon where radiation from a nuclear device fries electronics. In 1945, in the Nevada desert, scientists noticed after the explosion that their electronic stuff didn't work anymore. Further research determined that it was knocked out not by the shock of the atomic blast, but by the radiation. The Department of Defense knows that at this moment, a rogue nation could detonate a nuclear device with high radiation, low yield, say 25 to 500 miles above the United States, and turn us into the Middle Ages. Nothing would work. It would shut off our utilities, our cars wouldn't run, which run off chips if you didn't know that. Nothing would work. No ATM machines, no stock market, nothing. We would be reduced to taking a baseball bat down to the corner to defend ourselves and trying to trade anything we could for water and food. It would be a complete disaster. You want some more bad news so you don't sleep tonight? It doesn't have to take a rogue nation to do this. Russia or China wouldn't do it because they know we could retaliate with our submarines and wipe them out in 10 minutes. So the rogue nation could be North Korea. But it gets worse. It could be a sunstorm on the surface of the sun. Science tells us that there's a history of a violent storm on the sun every 150 years. The last one was in 1859. This may make you want to go home and see if your garage can hold water and food. We have an article from the Wall Street Journal by none other than a former CIA director saying that North Korea has all the technology today to launch an EMP attack over the United States because they're putting up satellites. And he says the technology to put the right kind of nuclear device on a satellite and come in from our south edge where we have no missile defense, it could happen because North Korea isn't seen as a rational state. That's the bad news. The good news is Dennis Rodman may save us. Electromagnetic propulsion rail guns, I'll show you a picture of those. 3D printers, I got a picture of that. Missile carriers could replace aircraft carriers. There are some people in the Navy that say, why have an aircraft carrier? We can put missiles galore out that can hit a postage stamp at 500 miles. Do we really need airplanes to do that? So it's within the realm of possibility that missile ships might evolve to become the thing of the future. But a missile can't go out and give you the intelligence that the X-47 Leap is. So who knows? We never know what the future holds. We're going to be continuing to do a dance with China on the horizon because they represent a threat, and we can't figure out exactly what they're capable of doing. We know they want a hegemony in the Western Pacific, and we know that they've got the money to build a fantastic Navy. They've had a 20-year start, and it takes about 30 years to build a world-class Navy. So they're getting close. They have a missile defense system that would prevent us from getting within a couple thousand miles of the China coast. So if we ever fight China, it has to be out in the deep blue sea. And we believe that with that missile system, they have no reason to ever want an aircraft carrier, and yet they have one. They bought it from the Russians, and they're working on developing it. We think the only reason they want to do that is to go beyond their missile defense and hold us at bay at a further point away from. But they are in disagreement with their neighbors on a number of issues. They're becoming belligerent, and that's exactly why the recent pronouncement of Obama was we're going to pivot to the Pacific. It's because all of our allies are asking, what are you going to do? How are you going to help us? Integrated unmanned systems. We have to integrate all these unmanned systems so that they can communicate and intelligence can get back to the mothership from different kinds of unmanned systems. This is a picture of a currently deployed experimental laser weapon on a destroyer. Lasers can zap an airplane out of the sky that's going less than the speed of sound. Anything above that, it's not developed yet to the point where it can do that. They tell me that a laser beam doing that costs about $1. Some missiles run as high as several $1 million. So there is some economic advantage to the continued development of laser weapons. This is a 3D printer. If you Google 3D printers, you'll get a lot of different pictures because there's so many different kinds. This is not a U.S. Navy product or even a Navy experiment. I just went to the internet and picked a photo to represent what one of them looks like. They take a 3D object or a three-dimensional object and scan it and then inject a powder that's the substance they want to build it with, and then lasers come in at angles and fry the powder into a solid form and build a three-dimensional figure. If you put in the powder that is titanium, you can build a part for a ship or a missile that's stronger than the way we're building them today and cheaper. What this means for the Navy is you can put one of these suckers on a ship and you don't have to carry so many spare parts. If you need a spare part, you just copy it and build it right on the ship. Fascinating new science. If you want to Google, just Google 3D printers. If you Google US Navy 3D printers, they'll have some articles, but we really don't have a Navy prototype yet. There's experimentation going on. This is an electromagnetic railgun. This is firing a projectile out of a barrel like a gun that you'd see on a gun on a cruiser or a battleship or a destroyer. But it shoots the projectile without any blast from something like gunpowder. It's all done with electricity by having these rails with different one plus and one minus. And I'm not a scientist, but when you shoot it out of the barrel, it leaves a plasma cloud, and that's what that is. The things come out so fast that it doesn't have to explode to destroy the target. The expression in the world of experimentation with these things is that speed kills. If you take a 7-pound projectile made of tungsten, it can blow right through a tank. If you angle the gun upwards, it can go 2,000 nautical miles and hit a 15-foot target. If you level it to be level with the Earth, it can go through sheet steel and go another 5 miles before gravity brings it to Earth. Incredible potential, but still experimental. We're experimenting with robots aboard ship because they can do things where you don't want to send a human in because of the threat to life. They also don't need health care and a pension. I was going to talk just briefly about my own experiences in the Navy. I'll really keep this brief. I went through Naval Officer Candidate School 50 years ago. I was faced with applying as a line or staff officer. I applied for the supply as a staff officer with a degree in business. I thought I'd be a shoo-in. They said, no, but you can be a line officer. A line officer gets you a star here and says you're eligible for command at sea. What that really means is when you get aboard ship, you have to stand watch. The supply types, of course, they have their problems with money and spare parts, but they don't have to stand watch. Officer Candidate School is a high-stress environment where they intend to flunk out the bottom 10%. They put you through incredible mental stress. It's how fast can you read and retain, which is good training because when you get aboard ship and don't know anything, what you have to do is learn quickly, very, very quickly. And that's what there's no physical strain at Officer Candidate School. It's not the only way to get in the Navy. I don't see anybody here that looks young enough to be interested. But there are several routes to become a naval officer. One is Naval ROTC at a university that offers it. The other is to get a degree and apply for Officer Candidate School. Another is if you're a junior in college, majoring in the right thing, the Navy will pay all your college expenses to finish if you make a commitment to stay in the Navy for a while afterwards. And then there's the Naval Academy. So there's a lot of different ways that you can become a naval officer. And then there's Pensacola, Florida, if you want to get going flying in the Navy. You go to officer candidate school in Florida. I filled out a dream sheet asking for Pearl Harbor. I wanted warm weather. Destroyers were kind of a romantic fighting ship, and I wanted to be a weapons officer. Instead, I got Norfolk, Virginia, and Oiler in communications. That's the government. Graduation day is something I'll never forget. I graduated the day Kennedy was assassinated. I joined the Navy during the Cuban blockade. I would love to stand here and tell you that joining the Navy during the Cuban blockade was because of a wave of patriotism and a hatred of the Soviet Union. Actually, at the peak of maturity, I joined the Navy because I wanted to go to Newport, Rhode Island because of the scenery, and I liked the dress white uniform of the Navy better than the other services. And there's the dress white uniform. Surprisingly, how few times I got to wear that after I went in the fleet. I was sent immediately after communication school to the Mediterranean, and my ship, the Oiler in the middle, is fueling an aircraft carrier to port and a destroyer to starboard. These things carry so much oil that we could do about 5 of these at the same time. While we're hooked up to the carrier, 5 destroyers would zip by. An aircraft carrier like that would hold almost as much oil as the Oiler. They're just that big. This happens to be the Shangri-La. I don't know how many of you know how I acquired that name. Cliff's nodding because he knows. Following Pearl Harbor, the United States was looking for some kind of good news because all we had was bad news. So the Army, Air Corps, and the Navy hatched a plot to send long-range bombers off a carrier. They couldn't come back to the carrier, but they could at least launch them. So they went as far as they could towards Japan and launched them called the Doolittle raid. This was a suicide mission where they dropped bombs on Tokyo and then you're on your own. They hoped to land in China in a friendly location where they could be rescued by the Chinese. But there were a lot of Japanese in China, so some of them got killed when they landed. Some killed because the landing wasn't smooth, and others actually were rescued and came back alive. But after the bombing raid, the reporters descended on Roosevelt and demanded a news conference, and he was asked, where could you possibly have sent out long-range bombers to Tokyo? And Roosevelt, with his cigarette holder at a jaunty angle, said they flew from our secret base in Shangri-La. And they named the next carrier down the chute after the secret base in Shangri-La. I think I've exhausted your patience and your ability to sit in the chair, so I'm going to skip through my other naval stuff and talk for a moment about books. I told you I was going to try to sell you on some books. Guns, Germs, and Steel is an excellent book if you have any curiosity about how geography drives history. It's a fascinating book and explains why the exploration of the ocean started in Western Europe instead of all the other places on the planet that it could have started. It all has to do with the rate at which they domesticated plants and animals. Fascinating book. If you have any interest in the British Navy and its impact on world order today, this is the book, To Rule the Waves by Arthur Herman, where he says that the British Royal Navy came to rule the waves against all their European rivals and did more to shape world order than any other institution before passing its elements on to the United States Navy. Almost all of our naval procedures, customs, tactics, and everything came from the British Navy. If you have any interest at all in World War II, you need to read No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin, a study of Roosevelt during just his war years and how the politician had to manage prosecuting the war against Japan and Germany and at the same time getting reelected. And he was a politician and knew how to do it, but he also had to be commander-in-chief. The story on who his advisors were and how things worked is just fascinating. The Admirals is a great book to give you an understanding of the strategy in the Pacific. It was hatched by the 4 5-star generals, Leahy, who was Roosevelt's closest military advisor, King, who was the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations in D.C., Nimitz, who had the responsibility for the Pacific, and Halsey, who was on the tip of the spear, so to speak. Their experience, knowledge, and political influence set the winning strategy for the war. Bear in mind that all of these admirals served on both submarines and carriers before they reached their 5-star rank, so they had an appreciation of the power of submarines and carriers. At the end of the war, Halsey was asked, other than our fighting spirit, what caused us to win the war in the Pacific? And his response was submarines, radar, and bulldozers. Now, that's a Navy guy's way of giving kudos to the B-29s, because the airstrips had to be rebuilt and extended for long-term bombers, long-range bombers, and of course the Navy Seabees needed bulldozers to do that. But he wasn't about to compliment the Army Air Corps. Everybody should read Fly Boys. Fascinating book because of the outcome of the war crimes trials after the war. Information that was held classified for 50 years so that families wouldn't have to read about it is the basis for this book. Unbelievable book emphasizing the lives of about half a dozen carrier pilots. These are the statistics that I mentioned about losses in Tokyo and Berlin from bombing. And this is a brand new book that every American should read. Mayday, the decline of American naval supremacy. This is all based on the theory that our economic condition compared to China's and our Navy compared to China's said that there's not a logical way out for us unless there's some dramatic changes. And the only way it could change quickly is through a shot in the arm of our economy so that we'd have more money in the budget for shipbuilding. That's kind of the end of my talk. I want to leave you with some stimulating thoughts, and then you're free to ask questions. Admiral Mullen, 2010, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that our biggest national security problem is our national debt. This is a military guy. How's this for keeping you awake at night? In the year 2019, the interest on the national debt will be 73% larger than the 2010 entire Defense Department budget. The reason for that, I have a math major in the back, and Bill Hazelwood, is the growth rate of the interest on the debt is 14% a year. The defense budget is 1.8% a year, and he knows what interest will do over a period of time. China's shipbuilding in deadweight tons. This is the number of tons that a ship can carry before it would sink. 1980, 220,000 deadweight tons of shipbuilding in China. 1996, 13 million. 2010, 20 million. Now, remember, commerce begets sea power begets commerce. Gross domestic product in China in 1980 was 250 bucks. 2010, 6,827. China military spending, 2002, 20 billion a year. 2012, 180 billion a year. Another stimulating thought. Our Defense Department today occupies 10 times the square footage that did during World War II when our military was 7 times as big. That's the definition of bureaucracy. Our 2013 budget, totaling about 3.8 trillion, is 1/2 entitlements. Approximately. The other half, defense, is about half of that. If there's anything growing faster than the interest on the national debt, it's entitlements. That's because of our aging population and demographics. Hopefully you can still sleep tonight, but think about those storms on the sun's surface. See if your garage can hold any extra water.